Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections along with the daily mains answer writing program. In the analysis part, we'll first have a comprehensive discussion with respect to the evolving relations between India and China in the context of India-US trade tensions. Then in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to MS Swaminathan's greatest contribution, that is Green Revolution, its impact, challenges, and the need for a new revolution in the agriculture sector. Then in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles from a special perspective of the UPSC Prelims 2026 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Come to the very first topic of today's discussion. This is with respect to between Washington and Beijing, India's China card. In the theater of world politics, Henry Kissinger once said that there are no permanent friends or enemies, only interests are permanent. Nowhere this is more evident in the kind of dynamic, or rather I should say, the triangular dynamic which we are witnessing among India, China and the US. See, we all know that we have seen strained relations between India and the US, primarily because of the tough stance taken by President Trump with respect to the trade. He has imposed a lot of tariffs on Indian exports, and obviously this has negatively affected the Indian economy. As a result, India is coming closer with China and Russia. And it is in that context that we have Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visiting India, extending President Xi's invitation to Prime Minister Modi for the upcoming SCO summit in Tianjin. Now, this basically calls for a reset in the ties between India and China. Now, many international affairs experts, what they're saying is that India is trying to balance between the US on one side and Russia and China on the other. But what you have to understand, take a broader look, is that India is trying to create its own or carve its own strategic space. What we mean to say is exercising the strategic autonomy. And the real test of India's foreign policy would be that neither the US nor the China defines its destiny. That is what you have to understand. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be comprehensively covering India-China relations and see what are the challenges, why China is really very important for India, and what should be the way forward for India, right? Very important part of GS2 international relations, and as always, it would be a very comprehensive discussion. Now, whenever we talk about the India-China relations, you can look at from the perspective of the mix of 3 C's. That is, there have been times of conflicts. India and China have had a lot of conflicts. For example, the 1962 war or the 2017 Doklam clashes. So we have had frequent border skirmishes, frequent border standoffs, right? Second, we have also witnessed the periods of cooperation. Yes, India and China have cooperated with each other. For example, let's talk about making the functioning of the global institutions, for example, the IMF or the World Bank or the WTO, more inclusive in nature. We have had the same voice. India and China had the same voice. Third, there have been periods of competition. Now, this is quite important. See, in the Asian context, we are 2 giants, India and China. And both are trying to carve their own strategic space. And this has led to a kind of a strategic competition between China and India, right? So this is what you have to understand, especially in the context of Indo-Pacific domain. Now, the geopolitical complexities have also affected the relation to a large extent. I'll give you the example. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. And then what we witnessed was the aggressive rise of China. And this made India to incline towards the West, primarily the United States of America. And then what we saw was a kind of a bitter relation between India and China. Recently, what we have witnessed is that US has imposed a lot of sanctions, tariffs on India. And as a result, it has affected the Indian economy. And therefore, we have come closer to China. That is why what we say is that the geopolitical realities also shape the bilateral relations. Now, let's talk about the evolution of the relations between India and China. When we talk about the ancient era, there were close cultural and religious ties. For example, we had a lot of Chinese traveler. For example, the Faxin in 5th century or Xuanzang in 7th century. They traveled to India. And we had the Indian travelers, for example, Bodhidharma traveling to China. So that also led to the spread of Buddhism in China, right? Also, we had the Silk Route, where a trading of a lot of commodities took place, precious gems and stones. So that was quite important. In the medieval period, what we saw was the phase of limited interactions. Primarily because we had the establishment of the Islamic regimes in the country and more of trade routes opened, especially on the western side. So there were periods of limited interactions. However, through the maritime trade, we have had interactions with the Chinese. How? that via the Southeast Asian countries, we had close interactions with the Chinese people. Then in the colonial era, what we saw was that both India and China suffered because of the colonial exploitation. You must have heard about the Opium Wars, where the British India also led the war against the Chinese. So ultimately, what you have to see is that we had the shared experience of Western exploitation. And Tagore also visited China. You must understand that we also had Mahatma Gandhi, who basically supported the resistance of Chinese with respect to the aggressions committed by the Japanese in the Second World War. So that was the kind of ideals we had. And we shared the anti-imperialist sentiment. Then post-independent, what we saw, that India was one of the first countries to recognize the People's Republic of China in the year 1950. And in the year 1954, we came up with the principles of peaceful coexistence, what we call as the Panchsheel. For example, mutual non-aggression or non-interference in the internal matters. However, what we saw was that there were some differences which arose over Tibet. And in 1959, what we saw, that there was an uprising in Tibet. And ultimately, it led to the Dalai Lama, 14th Dalai Lama, taking refuge in the country, in India. And what we saw was that this phase marked a kind of a more bitter relations between India and China. And ultimately, we had the 1962 Sino-Indian War of 1962, where unfortunately, India had to face the defeat. Also, we have had the clashes in Sikkim. As I told you, we have had frequent border skirmishes. Sikkim in 1967 or Somdorang, Chu Valley in 1987. This is in Arunachal Pradesh. And this phase was characterized by diplomatic freeze. What do you mean by that? That there was limited formal interaction. There was, in fact, no formal interaction, and we had a kind of a stagnation in the relationship. Then there was the normalization and strategic rivalry, starting from 1988, when we saw that the relations were, both the authorities tried to make the relations or mend the relations on the right track, and we saw the visit of Rajiv Gandhi in China in 1988. And then there was the Peace and Tranquility Agreement signed by India and China, primarily with reference to the border areas, right? Now, the recent challenges started from the year 2008. Why 2008? Because it was in 2008 that China became India's largest trade partner, right? And we had a lot of border disputes on the eastern sector, also on the western sector, and we had skewed trade relations. See, what you have to understand is that China is one of the largest trading partner of India. And the kind of trade scenario which we have is highly skewed in favor of China. There is a kind of trade deficit to almost $100 billion with respect to China. So this is a very depending situation we have with respect to China. And ultimately, we also have the geopolitical rivalry, right? Because what China perceives is that India is a kind of a partner or an alliance partner of the West, which India says it is not, right? So that is the reason that we have had constant geopolitical rivalry with respect to China. Now, the current context, as I already told you, we had the Chinese foreign minister coming here and inviting Prime Minister Modi for the upcoming SCO summit in Tianjin. And this creates the backdrop. And that's the reason many of the international affairs experts, what they're saying is that this is a time to reset the relations between India and China. Now, India is right now focusing upon this very important concept, and that is strategic hedging. As I told you, that many international affairs experts, what they say is that India is trying to balance the relation between the West and the East, primarily between the US and China. So that is the kind of strategic hedging which we call. And that's the reason that we have had close interactions with Russia and China. And this triangular framework of Russia, India and China is taking shape. It's becoming more robust. Also, we are giving voice to the BRICS, right? And therefore, see again, BRICS is something which has always been a kind of a counter force to the other Western-led institutions. And we have given more voice to the BRICS. So this, in a way, has also antagonized US, right? So that is what you have to understand. Now, what are the issues and challenges? See, even though we have had Chinese foreign minister coming to India and inviting Prime Minister Modi, but the structural realities don't change. That is what you have to understand. And at the core of all the issues lies the border dispute. There is a very serious dispute with respect to the demarcation of the borders, right? So we have the LAC, line of actual control, which is not a legally defined border. That is what you have to understand. It's a de facto border where we have the militaries of both the countries taking a stand over there, right? So we have had a lot of standoffs at the LAC. So just look at this particular picture. The LAC is primarily comprised of three sectors. We have the western sector, we have the central sector, and we have the eastern sector, right? Now, what you have to understand is that in the 1962 war, where India ultimately, unfortunately, faced defeat. We had the Chinese authority unilaterally declaring the ceasefire and withdrawing from this particular area. Now, this is basically the McMahon line, which India says that this is the border we have, but China claims this part, the red part, as a part of its own territory, which is obviously not, because it lies in the overall sovereign control of India. Then in the 1962 war, what happened was that almost an area of 38,000 kilometer square was basically captured by Chinese authorities, and this is what we call as the Aksai Chin area. And there are certain other disputed areas in the central sector in the states of Himachal and Uttarakhand. That is what you have to understand, right? So if you just look at this particular infographic, you would have to understand that it was in 1963 that Pakistan ceded a particular territory, which we call as Shaksukam Valley, to China, right? And this is Aksai Chin, where Chinese established their control after 1962 war, right? And we have had a lot of clashes, for example, at Galwan Valley, Depsang Plain. Then we had clashes at Sumar when Xi Jinping visited India in 2014. So we have had these clashes regularly. Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. Now, China has also constructed a lot of dual-use villages. See, on one hand, it is focusing upon the creation of civilian infrastructure. But also on the other hand, it is trying to build in military installations. Now, this is something which is a strategic concern for India, right? Along the borders. Then there have been economic imbalances and trade deficit. There is a massive trade deficit with respect to China. So in the year 2024-25, we almost had a trade deficit of $99 billion. Can you imagine? Almost $100 billion. Now this is a very strategic concern for India. We are totally dependent upon China for the strategic supply of industrial materials, right? Exponential rise in exports from China, especially after 2008. And there also has been consistent backdoor entry. What do we mean by that? See, we have close relations with ASEAN countries. And China also is having a trade partnership agreement, that is RCEP with the Asian countries, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And we are not a member of RCEP. Now, what is happening is that many of the Chinese communities, they are going into the Asian countries and then they are being rerouted to India, right? And they are then violating the rules of origin. And this is basically compromising the efficiency, or let's say the profit of the Indian enterprises. That is what you have to understand. Then there are issues with respect to water disputes. Chinese authorities have complete control over the upstream rivers. See, we have the Brahmaputra river, which in India we call as Brahmaputra, and the Chinese call it as Yalungzangpo. You can just have a look over here. So you have Yalungzangpo, and it makes a turn over here. And this is the Midog County in the Tibet region. And the mountain over here is Namcha Barwa, where it takes a sudden turn and enters India. Now, over here in the Medok County, we have Chinese authorities coming up with one of the largest hydroelectric power projects in the world. And this is a strategic concern for India, because Chinese can use this particular hydroelectric dam as a kind of weapon. For example, as a kind of a water bomb, right? They can release a lot of amount of water and ultimately it would inundate, it would flood the downstream areas in the country, and it can lead to huge flooding in the states of Assam. So that is a very strategic concern. Constructed the multiple dams. You can just have a look at this particular infographic. We have had a lot of these dams being constructed by the Chinese authorities. And again, there is no water sharing treaty between India and China. See, these are the rivers which create or lead to a lot of flooding in the downstream areas, for example, in Assam. And for that, we need robust hydrological data. But after 2017, after the Doklam standoff, China has not been sharing the hydrological data with respect to the amount of water which is flowing in the rivers. And this is again leading to a lot of flood-like situations in the downstream states of Assam, right? Next, we have a lot of cyber threats. See, what we have seen is that, especially after the COVID-19 crisis, what we saw, many of the affiliated Chinese groups, for example, you must have heard about a particular group which is Red Eco. It's a Chinese state-sponsored group. They have perpetrated a lot of cyber attacks, and especially on the critical infrastructure in India. We have had a lot of discoms, power distribution companies. Their systems have been crippled by these cyber attackers. So this is what you have to understand. And in Maharashtra discom, it was attacked. The systems were attacked. The whole framework was attacked. And ultimately, it led to the complete power outage in Mumbai. So this is a very serious strategic concern for India. And we have, as a response measure, what we have done is we have banned a lot of Chinese apps. More than 200 plus apps have been banned. But it doesn't matter, because we have already a lot of Chinese investments coming in the Indian startups. So that it doesn't matter. Next, we have the regional influence competition. See, China has been coming up with its own magnum opus, that is the Belt and Road Initiative, and we have one of the very important component of BRI as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where China has invested or is planning to invest almost more than $65 billion. Now, this basically connects the Kashgar in China to Gwadar in Pakistan, and it violates India's sovereignty because it runs through the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So this is a very strategic concern for India, and it is trying to create its own niche space in Pakistan at the Gwadar port. You must also understand that Chinese authorities have invested billions of dollars in different countries. For example, in Quoc Phu port in Myanmar, or let's say the Chittagong port in Bangladesh, or let's say the Hambantota in Sri Lanka, or the Djibouti port. So it is creating a kind of a string of pearls around India, right? And these facilities which Chinese authorities are constructing, they are of dual purpose. That is, they're also making sure that there are military installations at these locations. And there have been military cooperation with Pakistan. We all know that there was a supply of the atomic technology to Pakistan, and ultimately that was a result. It led to the creation of Pakistan as a nuclear state. Then diplomatic and international forums. China has subsequently, at different times, restricted India's entry in the nuclear suppliers group, and also in the UNSC. You must be aware that when it was declaring Masood Azhar as an international terrorist, China basically stopped that again and again. So this is a very strategic concern. Deep inroads in Latin America and Africa. See, there have been billions of dollars have been invested in different countries in Africa and Latin America. In Latin America, we have the triangle, the lithium triangle, if you're aware. Tell me the name of the countries. Primarily to exploit the natural resources of these countries. For example, we have countries like Congo in Africa or Namibia, right? So Chinese authorities have been exploiting these countries. They're not, see, initially they promised that they are going to give skills, they're going to create infrastructure, they're going to transfer technology, but none of that has taken place. Ultimately, what we are saying is that they're exploiting the raw materials like lithium, and then they're exporting to their own country, China, and then they're processing there itself, right, and earning the whole profit. So that is a kind of situation which is being witnessed. Now, I just told you about this particular. Have a look. We have the eastern sector, the western sector, and the central sector. Now, what is the importance of China for India? The very first is raw material dependency. India, as I told you, in the financial year 2024-25, China was the second largest trading partner of India. The first was the US. And we are critically dependent upon the supplies which are basically exported by China, primarily the industrial supplies. And this is again a very strategic concern for India. We are heavily reliant on Chinese supply. For example, let's talk about the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are the backbone of the pharmaceutical industry. More than 70% of the APIs, they are basically imported from China. Or let's talk about the solar modules, the solar cells. Or let's talk about the critical minerals. You must be surprised to know that when we talk about bismuth and when we talk about the other element, which is lithium, we are almost 80% dependent upon China. For titanium and silicon, we are almost 60% dependent upon China. So this is a very strategic concern for India. Or let's talk about the heavy construction or engineering equipments. We are all importing from China, right? Or be it the smartphones. See, 80% of total solar imports are from China, right? Or let's say we have electronic components. As I told you, see, you can have even the manufacturers from Japan or South Korea or America with respect to the smartphones. But ultimately what you have to understand is that the assembly or the components of that phones are basically being manufactured in China. We have these telecommunication companies like ZTE or Huawei, all are based in China, and we are critically dependent. Technology and digital infrastructure. Despite bans, what we have been seeing is that there is a Chinese dominance with respect to the electronic market. You go to any shop, you will find all the electronic equipments being manufactured in China. Why is that so? If we have implemented the ban, it should not be there, right? Then we have Chinese smartphones. Almost 75% of the smartphones which are being used in India, they are basically in one form or the other being manufactured in China, right? Critical telecommunications, as I gave you the example, we are basically going for, we have been giving the experiments. There are experiments being taken place for the 6G, right? And the government has called for different telecommunications company to participate, and we had the government has said that we are not incorporating the Chinese company, because in the 5G what we saw was that there were allegations that the companies like ZTE and Huawei, they are stealing the core data right? And these telecommunications, what you have to understand is they're being used in strategic sectors like defense or space. So therefore, it creates a strategic concern for India. And battery technology, you must be aware of a particular company, BYD, right? So BYD is a dominant player with respect to the electric vehicles, or let's say the basic battery technology. China is a dominant player. Then investment and expertise. China has invested a lot of billions of dollars with respect to the infrastructure development, for example, the high-speed rail. So they have a very good project management capacity, and therefore many of the Chinese consultation companies are in fact working in the country, right? Because they have those skills, required skills to implement a particular project. Several Indian startups, more than 20 Indian startups have had billions of dollars being given by the Chinese investors. So what we see is, for example, also we have Zomato, we have other startups including Byju's, all received funding from the Chinese investors, right, including the Paytm. Then we have the trade route dependency. What you have to understand is that the Southeast Asia, most of these countries have come in a trade partnership with China, that is the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And more than 50% of India's total volume of trade passes through the strategic South China Sea and Strait of Malacca. Now, this is again a very strategic concern for India. Why? Because we have been witnessing the Chinese patrolling these particular areas, right? And they have posed challenges to the other countries in the region. So therefore, again, a very important concern. Then we have diplomatic space. What we are trying to say is that in the important institutions, for example, the BRICS or the SCO or the G20, China is one of the most eminent member, one of the most important player. So we cannot negate or we cannot ignore the Chinese in these bodies, and therefore China's participation and a good relation or a good rapport with Chinese authorities is a must. Then we have strategic hedge. We cannot be over dependent upon any country, be it the US or any other country, and therefore we need to develop good relations which are mutually beneficial for both China as well as India, right? So therefore this is again very important. Now, what should be the way forward for India? The very first is economic diversification and self-reliance. See, after COVID-19, what we thought was that different countries, that they are going to basically reduce their dependency upon China. They'll go for economic decoupling and they would diversify the supply chain. But none has happened. In fact, even most of the countries, they're critically dependent upon Chinese imports. So that is a very important area of concern which we'll have to see. And therefore, we'll have to work upon in order to convert this particular idea. We said that we are going to be Atmanirbhar. So we'll have to be self-reliant and we'll have to invest in different sectors. We'll have to incentivize different sectors so that we become competitive. Our industries are as competitive to the enterprises in China, right? Domestic manufacturing must be given an impetus, and the schemes like the production-linked incentive. Just we saw recently that the production linked incentive scheme is not working for every sector. So we need to just find out that what are the loopholes, what are the inefficiencies in the particular scheme, and then we need to basically reform that particular scheme and give an impetus to those particular sectors. Or let's say the semiconductor, where we are critically dependent upon the supplies of lithium or silicon from the Chinese. So that is again concern. Strategic partnership must be made. For example, we can have strategic partnerships with respect to countries like Japan so that they can basically transfer the technology and we can come up with our own indigenous products so that we are not heavily reliant on Chinese products, right? Boost the MSMEs. How we can do so? Make our MSMEs more productive. See, what we are trying to say is just trying to formalize them. That's not enough. Try to provide them the credit, interest, subvention schemes, right? Or make them to upgrade their technology so that they can equally compete with the Chinese enterprises. MSMEs, they're the backbone of the India's economy and they contribute enormously when we talk about India's exports. So they have to be given an impetus. And standards and certification processes must be improved. See, if you want, we definitely impose a lot of anti-dumping duties on the imports from the China. But many of the times Chinese authorities have said is that the Indian authorities don't follow a particular standard or certification process. So we'll have to come up with a particular standard for ourselves so that our application or the imposition of the anti-dumping duties or any kind of duty must be in WTO compliance. That is what we are talking about. Then strategic military modernization. The defense budget of China is almost 4 times that of India. So we'll have to invest heavily in the military. See, we have definitely done a lot of things. For example, we are constructing the strategic roads in the border areas. Or for example, we have come with the advanced landing grounds, right? But more has to be done. More has to be done so that we can basically counter the threats which are being posed by the Chinese authorities along the LAC. Enhance the surveillance, be it through the drones, be it through the other unmanned aerial vehicles. Do it. and mountain warfare capabilities. See, most of this particular region, what you have to understand, it's situated in the grim winter scenario, right? So you need to have trained personals who have proper skills with respect to the mountain warfare. So that skills, that particular armory or that particular strategy has to be provided to the armed forces, be it the army or be it the ITBP. So it has to be given, right? Next aspect is regional leadership enhancement. We have to collaborate more with the regional countries. There has to be increased assistance being given to the countries like Sri Lanka, or let's say we have the countries like Nepal or Bhutan, so that they don't fall in the laps of China. We have seen what has happened in countries like Myanmar. Myanmar has very close military relations with China, or in fact Bangladesh. After the removal of Sheikh Hasina, what we have seen is that it is more inclined. It is having a more close partnership with China. Pakistan, we already know what is the situation. So we need to have close partnerships with Sri Lanka. We need to provide them the affordable lines of credit to Sri Lanka, to Nepal, and to Bhutan. Then BIMSTEC must also be focused so that we can have a close-knit partnership among various countries. Indian Ocean Regional Association must be also focused in the Indian Ocean particular region, and alternate supply chain networks must be explored. See, these ideas like supply chain resilience initiative, where we had countries like Australia and Japan coming together, it needs to be realized in true form. Because right now what we are saying is, even after saying a lot of times that these supply chains must be diversified, we are critically, not just India, almost all the countries are critically dependent upon China. So that must not be there. Diplomatic engagement strategy. See, what you have to understand and accept the fact is that China has a very strong diplomatic capital, like the US. So we need to invest in our own diplomacy, right? We need to have multiple channels of communication. We cannot just rely or be over dependent upon a particular country, right? So that needs to be improved. Dialogue through multiple channels, be it the track 1 diplomacy, the official, or the track 2 diplomacy, the unofficial. Active participation in multilateral forums, be it the WTO, be it the G77, or be it the other forums or the G20. We need to participate and we need to come with the issue-based coalitions, right? That is very, very important. Let's say the case of climate change, right? So, see, we know that India and China are one of the largest emitters of the carbon dioxide. And definitely we are working upon that. But Western countries are forcing us to basically improve, our technology or retard the economic progress. That cannot happen. So we need to collaborate. We need to collaborate with Chinese authorities, or the Chinese should collaborate with us, so that we can create a pressure upon the Western authorities so that they truly fulfill this aspect of the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, right? That is very, very important. And continue the strategic autonomy. That's something which we cannot really ignore. Strategic autonomy has been the key principle of India's foreign policy, and we must basically follow that. Recently, a lot of steps have been taken, and this is a particular snippet from the Indian Express. 3 new mechanisms to manage the border, agree to discuss and de-escalate at the LSE, facilitate the trade and investment flows, border trade via the designated points, resumption of direct flights. So it's a good step, definitely. See, what we are trying to say is that we cannot be over-reliant on any country. And these 2 countries, they cannot decide the destiny of India, right? So we must not say that we are trying to balance between the US or the China. No, we're not trying to balance. We are trying to create our own strategic space, because that is a necessity. We are not having an alliance partnership with any other country, right? So therefore it is very, very important that we develop a kind of a respect where the other party gives a mutual respect, right? There has to be a mutual respect, and China on its part should realize that it has to consider India as an equal partner. It cannot have that middle kingdom syndrome. It cannot have that something in as a kind of a superiority in its mind. So that's very important, and again, it's a step in the right direction, and let's see what happens in future. But again, strategic autonomy is a key principle, and we need to carve our own strategic space. Let's have a mains practice question. In the backdrop of an evolving global order marked by the US-India trade tensions and US-China rivalry, India finds itself navigating a complex relationship with China. Critically examine how India can balance its strategic vulnerabilities with economic dependencies, shaping its foreign policies towards China. Very important question, especially for this year's mains. Please do try to write an answer. 15 marks, 250 words. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button and let us know in the comment section. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect towards a new revolution in Indian agriculture. In 1960s, India was reeling with a severe food security issue. The food productivity was very low, and there were several instances of hunger and malnutrition. It was then the pioneering steps taken by M.S. Swaminathan which ultimately led to the Green Revolution, and India became a food surplus country. And this is a particular editorial which has been featured in the Hindu, written by Montek Singh Ahluwalia. gives a tribute to MS Swaminathan. But in the end of the article, he talks about the need of the hour, that what should be done in the Indian agriculture, where he says that India was ahead of China in agriculture research in the late 1960s. But today, China has 8 agriculture research institutions in the top 10, and India does not have any in the top 200. So we made a lot of progress during those years, but we have not continued doing so. And he also gives a very important data where he says that India spends only 0.43% of our agriculture GDP in the research and development, whereas the percentage in China is twice our level. Now, what you have to understand is that definitely Green Revolution led to surplus in the food production, but it also led to 2 negative externalities. The very first is the environment degradation. Because in the Green Revolution, we emphasize upon the heavy usage of these chemicals like pesticides, insecticides, or fertilizers, which ultimately led to the environment degradation. Second negative externality is with respect to the increasing inequality. Among the farming community, there has been an increasing inequality because the focus of the Green Revolution was not on the entire country. The focus was limited to certain pockets, and therefore the farmers in those regions, they benefited, whereas the farmers in the other region, they did not, and therefore a disparity is created. So there is a need for another Green Revolution, which we often say as Green Revolution 2.0. That's the overall gist. So as I said, what was the Green Revolution? It was the increase in the production and quality of food crops, not just the overall production, but also their nutritional content, the quality, by adoption of new technologies. For example, by using the high yielding variety seeds, or increased use of pesticides or chemicals, or increased mechanization, for example, use of harvesters or threshers, right? But why did India actually need it? See, as I told you, in 1960s, India was dealing with a food crisis, right? And there were several instances of hunger and malnutrition. Because, see, the population was booming in this particular period, but the food was limited, right? So there was a mismatch. And therefore, there was a very serious concern that there can be a very serious tragedy, right? Therefore, a need was felt that we'll have to integrate technology, come up with a particular step so that there is an increase in the production of the food. Then we were also vulnerable to the external pressures. For you must have heard about the PL 480 program, which the article also mentions. So there were a lot of food aid given by different countries, and we had a particular aid given by the US. But these countries, the US or the other countries, they use these helps or these food aids as an instrument of diplomacy. So we were always susceptible to these countries. We had to basically succumb under the pressure. Whatever they said, we had to do it, right? Then self-reliance and food security was very important, because ultimately the very objective of a sovereign nation is to become self-reliant, right? And to make sure that there is complete food security. Then also to modernize the agriculture, to make our agriculture more productive. Because if we had to compete with other countries around the world, we needed to make sure that we incorporate different technologies so that our supply chain in the agriculture becomes more efficient, right? Now, what were the different mechanisms? You can also have a look. For example, we had the multiple cropping systems. Then we had seeds with superior genetics, what we call as high yielding variety seeds, SYV seeds, proper irrigation system, use of tube wells, canals, dams, pesticides and fertilizers, expanding the farming areas, and modern machines. Now, the very first is high yielding variety seeds. That is, per unit area, you get a higher productivity. That is what the high yielding variety seeds are, and primarily they were a result of technological interventions. Then new irrigation methods. See, primarily the farmers were basically relying on the rain-fed agriculture, right? And that was erratic, and ultimately in many cases it led to drought-like conditions. So therefore, there was a need felt to come up with proper irrigation techniques, be it through the canals, be it through the tube wells or dams, right? Then mechanization. For example, integrating these harvesters, threshers, mechanical instruments in the overall supply chain, making sure that drudgery is not involved, human labor is not involved, right? So as to make the process more efficient. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides, so as to increase the response rate of the soil, making sure that the kind of crops you are getting, they have the full nutritional content and they are growing at a good pace, right? Then multiple cropping, making sure that we are focusing upon multiple crops so that there is risk diversification, so that we can make sure that the farmer gets more of the income, right? Expansion of the farming area. See, again, the very objective was there were certain areas in the country, for example, the arid and the semi-arid zones, which could have been easily converted if you had proper irrigation supply chains. So those areas, for example, let's say in the western parts, we have the Indira Gandhi Canal, right? So those areas were exploited. so as to increase the farming areas so that we have more of the productivity in the agriculture, right? Now, what has been the impact of green revolution? The very first is increased food production. Because of these high yielding variety seeds, which give us more production per unit area, and we use a particular H5V seeds, that's the dwarf seed. India, which was a food deficient country and which was basically dependent upon the food aids by different countries around the world, we ultimately became a food surplus country in 1978-79. Look at this particular infographic. When we compare 1966 with 2022, there has been a substantial jump with respect to the overall production, right? That is a kind of improvement which we have witnessed. Reduce food imports. And being a food importer at a point of time, now we have emerged as a net exporter. So if you just look at the kind of exports, and the data is given by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, it says in the financial year 2023, we earned almost $52.5 billion as agriculture exports. In financial year 22, we earned almost $50.2 billion, right? Then poverty elevation. What you have to understand is that primarily the agriculture, the activity is carried out in the rural areas. And in the rural areas, we saw, because as the productivity increased, you had more of these farming community increasing income, right? So their incomes increased, and substantially what we found was that there was a reduction in the overall poverty in the rural areas. So it reduced from 50.1% in 93 and 94 to almost 25.7% in 2011-12. Then technological advancements. With the incorporation of technology, see, using fertilizers or chemicals is not bad, but the point is that you have to use it sustainably. You'll have to make sure that you use it in the amount which is required. If X amount is required, you use X. If you are oversupplying, that's going to definitely damage the soil. It's going to heat up the soil. And ultimately what would happen is the response rate of the soil would reduce. And ultimately we'll think that the soil is not responding. So we'll apply more of fertilizers. So there would be a vicious cycle. But if we have proper application of these fertilizers or threshers, or let's say the incorporation of technology, then it can lead to sustainable and efficient practices in the overall supply chain of the agriculture. Then rural development. Why? See, we did not just focus upon the H5V seeds. That's a very big misconception which people have. We also focus upon the other aspects. Creation of rural infrastructure, so as to make sure that the logistics is very good, right? We also focus upon building canals, right? So ultimately it led to the development of the rural areas, right? Because of the development in the infrastructure, be it in the form of roads, electrification, or irrigation, right? Reduction in the land conversion. It had positive environmental impact. See, initially what was being done was that because we are having less of food resources, we were basically going for deforestation, removing the forest areas for having a larger, farming lands. But slowly, once we had these H5V seeds, when the productivity increased, we required less of land. So we did not have to go for these deforestation. So ultimately that was a positive environmental externality. Then economic growth. Ultimately, see, we have more than, still now, 46% of the people participating in the agriculture. And at that time, the percentage was much more. So when you have, an increment in a particular sector, the increment in the productivity of a sector, definitely it has positive spillover effects in the overall economy. That's what we are focusing. So the green revolution definitely was one of the very important reasons with respect to the economic growth which India witnessed. And also you can just see highest ever exports achieved for staples like rice, wheat, sugar. And just look at this. Wheat exports jumped nearly fourfold from the year 2020-21 till the year 2021-22. You can just look, fourfold increase, right? Now, challenges brought by the green revolution. The very first is unprecedented environmental degradation. It was said that you use these synthetic inputs in the form of pesticides, chemicals, fertilizers, right? But what happened was that there was the unsustainable use. And as I said, that once you are applying more of fertilizers or chemicals, the response rate of the soil would reduce. And ultimately what would happen is the soil would heat up, and then all the chemicals would also percolate in the plants. And ultimately that would go in the human body, what we call as the bioaccumulation or biomagnification, right? That's the one aspect. But it is also reducing the productivity of the soil. That is what you have to understand. Synthetic inputs, unsustainable use of synthetic inputs. And also it led to soil erosion because the fields were flooded once you had these canals and tube wells. And we were growing this rice, wheat, right? So it required a lot of water. So in many cases, what happened, the top layer of the soil washed away, and that what led to the soil erosion. Water pollution, why? Because once you're applying these fertilizers, they percolate in the aquifers, deep down in the ground. And then the water is then polluted with these chemicals. You must have heard about, we covered in the Analyst, that there is a severe problem of water contamination. We have the fluoride contamination, the arsenic contamination, right? Why? Because these chemical inputs are being used, right? And that is one of the reasons. Loss of biodiversity of crops. Initially, we focus upon the indigenous varieties. The diet included a lot of these millets. But then, because of these grain revolution, there was an excessive focus upon the cereals. We had a focus upon the rice and the wheat. So, the nutritional content which humans were consuming also reduced, right? And there was excessive dependence upon these rice and wheat system. Indigenous varieties of even rice and wheat, we lost them, right? Social and economic inequalities. As I said, that the aspects of the green revolution were focused upon certain pockets. This was not something which was for the entire country. And slowly with time, what we saw was that there was increasing economic disparity. See, ultimately what happens, let's say you have a particular farmer and he's basically taking a loan so that he can basically buy the seeds, HYV seeds or some other mechanization. Let's say buy anything if the crop fails. Then the farmer is basically indebted, right? So many times what we have seen is there have been increasing cases of farmer suicides. Why? Why do even after green revolution, even after so many years in 2025-24, if you are witnessing a lot of farmers, especially in this particular region of Maharashtra, going for suicides, what is the reason? That they are not having the proper resources with them, right? Let's say sometimes what happens is that they have surplus of production, so they don't get the adequate price in the market, right? So there are a lot of issues. Then you have increased vulnerability of crops. See, once you have multiple cropping, what happens is that the resistance which plant have towards the pests and the insects, it's quite more, right? But once you go towards the monoculture, the susceptibility of this particular plant increases towards the pests and the other insects. And therefore, the susceptibility with respect to the disease also increases. So this ultimately compromises the productivity. And what farmer thinks is that he should apply more of these insecticides and pesticides, and ultimately you have these insecticides and pesticides going into the plants and ultimately the human body, and then basically percolating down in the groundwater and then polluting the groundwater sources, the aquifers. You can just also have a look. Soil degradation, the use of chemical fertilizers has led to soil degradation. Then loss of biodiversity, because we are going for monoculture practices, have reduced the biodiversity. Previously we had a lot of indigenous varieties, but now we are just focused upon rice and the wheat system. Increased chemical use, high use of chemical inputs has increased the pollution, right? The water pollution. Excessive use of pesticides has polluted the water sources, the water pollution. So it has led to a lot of environmental degradation. Also, what you have to understand is because of the change in the climate, because of the anthropogenic reasons, the human-induced climate change, what we see, on one hand, we have this particular factor of using these synthetic inputs, unsustainable use of these inputs. On the other hand, we also have the ill effects of climate change. That is severely affecting the resilience of the plants. It is making the plants to die, right? Because the plants do not have the adequate resilient capacity. You can just also have a look that because of the change in the climate, what we are witnessing is altered yields, increase virulent pathogens, increase gene transfer rate. So that is compromising the overall productivity of the soil. Also, what you have to understand is, look at this, how the fertilizer use has increased unsustainably. The soil requires a definite amount of fertilizer or chemical inputs, but because there is lesser response from the soil, farmer basically thinks that the soil is not responding, let's put more of fertilizers or chemical inputs, and therefore we are witnessing the unsustainable use of fertilizers and other chemical inputs. Now, what is the solution? The solution is what we call as Green Revolution 2.0. Here, the very objective is to make the agriculture adaptive and resilient. That is more important. Resilient and adaptive with respect to two very important things. First, the ill effects of climate change, and second, the kind of socio-economic inequalities we have. We have to make sure that there is parity, there is equality, there is equity in the farming community, right? And the focus has also to be on the food security in addition to nutritional security. We have surplus amount of food, but what we are witnessing is that we are having this issue of malnutrition. There is undernutrition, there is overnutrition. So we'll have to also focus upon the nutritional security. What we have to do? Biotechnology and genetic engineering. See, first you have to understand what is the difference between genetic engineering and genetic modification. In genetic engineering, we are not basically including any of the foreign gene. Whereas in genetic modification, we are including the foreign gene. That is a basic difference which you have to keep in mind. See, these technologies, if used in a proper manner, if we are sure that the kind of crops we are coming up with would be high yielding variety, would be drought resistant, would be more resilient. Why not use these technologies, right? So definitely we can go with these technologies, GM crops, precision agriculture. Use that much amount of input which is actually required by the soil, not over or not under, right? For that, precision agriculture is very important. That is, you use different technologies, artificial intelligence, or let's say you have the other technologies which basically measure the kind of content the soil has, and then you have the soil health card scheme, right? So on the basis of the requirements of the soil, you are basically giving the inputs. Internet of Things and other things. Optimize the use of resources. First benefit it would give is that lesser resources would be used. Second, it would make sure that you have productive ecosystems. You have productive ecosystems with respect to the farming aspect, right? And use of micro irrigation in the form of sprinkler irrigation or drip irrigations, not this unsustainable canal or tube well. Then we have sustainability. We have to come with sustainable practices. For example, let's say we have the integrated water management. Why not incorporate this in the overall water management? Definitely do that. Or we have also, by Subhash Palekar, we have the zero budget natural farming. Those practices can be incorporated. Jiva Mitra, right? Bij Mitra. So those must be incorporated. Then we should also go with diversification. What we are trying to say, that it is a time that we go for multiple cropping. We should move away from the rice wheat system. Why multiple cropping? Because it diversifies the risk. It gives more return to the farmer. So these are multiple benefits of the multiple cropping. Farmer-centric innovations, very important. Whatever policy you are coming up with, the farmer has to be at the center stage. So you will have to focus upon creating the farmer produce organizations so that the farmers get adequate price for their commodities, or the custom hiring centers. What do we mean by that? See, we have large farmers, right, who own acres of land. They have enough resources. They can go with any harvester or thresher. But let's talk about the small and marginal farmers. They don't have the adequate capacity. If they want to use any mechanized instrument, if they want to go for mechanization, how will they do so? Through the custom hiring centers. At a particular affordable cost, they can hire a particular instrument for a certain period of time so that they can use that particular instrument in their field. So custom hiring centers are very, very important. Holistic approach. See, what we're trying to say is that we cannot just focus upon, a particular aspect of, use less of fertilizers. No, there has to be a holistic approach. We'll have to go for water management. We'll have to make sure that we also go with the integration of technology. We also have to make sure that the farmers are included in the overall policy formulation. So there has to be the holistic approach with respect to the soil health. And we cannot just focus upon the production aspect. There has to be focus upon the overall supply chain. Be it the production, be it the marketing, be it the linkages among the farmers, right? So very, very important. Environmental considerations must also be there. We need to go for mitigation because, see, we are having the adverse impact of climate change, and that is in one way or the other also impacting the productivity of the crop, right? So we need to come up with those practices which are sustainable in nature, right? Let's come up with the high yielding variety seeds which are, let's say, the drought tolerant or which are salinity tolerant. Very, very important. Next, we have the climate resilient practices. See, what we are trying to say is that because of the ill effects of climate change, what we are witnessing is the sudden rise in the temperatures or the flooding. So we need to come up with those technologies. We need to come up with those high yielding variety seeds which can basically absorb these shocks, right? So that has to be made an integrated part of the overall food systems, agri systems. So again, what we are trying to say is that definitely green revolution did a lot of wonders. We, from a food deficient country, we became food surplus, but still there are, it created a lot of difficulties in the form of environmental degradation, in the form of disparities, right? And again, still we have this particular issue of nutritional security. Though we may have achieved the food security, right? But still nutritional security is something which we still aspire for. So we need to come up with these, with a larger construct of Green Revolution 2.0, and we need to focus upon these issues so that we can make the agriculture more sustainable, more environment friendly, and more productive in nature. Let's have a mains practice question. It says, discuss the need for a new revolution in the Indian agriculture in the context of the current challenges, highlight the challenges and the way forward to ensure the food security, environmental sustainability, and farmers' welfare. Do write a particular answer on this particular question. Let's go to the next part. Coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic which talks about the coming of sedition law in a new form. Let's have the gist of the article. See, we all know that we had section 124A of the Indian Penal Code. Now, that was a very horrific and a dreaded law. Many people, thousands of people were basically prosecuted under this particular law. Then we had the indigenized version, that is the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, and a particular section, section 152, have the similar provisions. Now, many of the people are alleging that this particular section of 152 is now being used to curb dissent. to curb the freedom of speech and expression, right? And what they're saying is that it is even more a dreaded form than the section 124A. Because there are certain arbitrary terms which are there in section 152 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. Now, if you just have a look, we have section 124A, right, which says whoever by words. Now, this was earlier. This was a part of the Indian Penal Code. Now we have the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. Whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representation, or otherwise, or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite dissatisfaction towards the government established by law in India, shall be punished with imprisonment for life. Can you just see that how open-ended this particular law is, right? And imprisonment for life, to which maybe fine may be added, or with imprisonment which may extend to 3 years, or to which maybe fine may be added. So this is again a very arbitrary law which was there. Now in the year 2022, Supreme Court kept this particular law in abeyance, said that no prosecution would further take place with respect to section 124A. And we all know that in July, on 1st of July 2024, we started with the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, right? So we now have this particular section 152, which has also been taken at the doorsteps of the Supreme Court in order to basically seek the constitutional validity of this particular section 152, right? Landmark ruling, Supreme Court orders sedition law to be kept in abeyance. This is from 2022. Now, what is section 152 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita? Act endangering sovereignty, unity and integrity of India, whoever purposely or knowingly, this is again adding the arbitrariness, by words either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representation, or by electronic communication, or by use of financial means. See how broad, how open-ended this particular law is all about. Or otherwise excites or attempts to excite secession or armed rebellion or subversive activities, or encourages feeling of separatist activities, or endangers sovereignty or unity and integrity of India, or indulges in or commits any such act, shall be punished with imprisonment for life, or with imprisonment which may be extend to 7 years, and shall also be liable for fine. So again, see, that is what different people are saying. They're alleging that now you have broadened the scope of this particular thing, and now most of the people, they're more, they're more prone to state coming and arresting them. And this is a particular incident where the Assam police has summoned the Wire editors Siddharth Varadarajan and Karan Thapa under section 152 of the BNS. And understand, these summons were issued on the same day on which the Supreme Court already protected them from coercive action in a petition challenging the law's validity. So there is also a kind of defiance which is being seen, that Supreme Court already initiated that these people must be protected against the coercive action. And on the same day, you had another summons being issued by the police, right? Summons lacked key details which should ideally be there, right? FIR date, copy of the FIR, nature of allegations. We have section 152 of the BNS. Critics had warned it was a renamed version of the colonial era section 124A of IPC. Section 152 is broader and more dangerous. Why? Have the reasons. Lower threshold for prosecution. So previously, section 124A had a higher threshold, right? If you would commit something to that level, you would be prosecuted. But now section 152 has a lower threshold. Anyone can be prosecuted in this particular thing, right? Knowingly dilute the intent requirement, vague grounds, sovereignty, unity and integrity of India open to wide interpretations. These were not present in 124A. Now you have included in section 152. Obviously, you have increased the open-endedness, risk of misuse, even fair criticism of the government policies could be criminalized. So these are one of the very serious issues. Threat to press freedom. Again, if you have, even if someone is coming up with a particular opinion in the newspaper, he'll not be able to do so because he'll have a fear in mind that I may be prosecuted under this particular thing. And that creates a chilling effect on the free expression, which is never good for a democratic society. Lack of safeguards enables arbitrary police action. We just saw that even though the Supreme Court has already issued this guideline that there should not be any coercive police action, on the same day the summons are being issued by the police. Again, in contravention to what the Supreme Court has said. Using secrecy and vague summons signals intimidation against media critical of government. See, there has to be constructive criticism. That should be, that should not be subverted. But again, through this, it is being subverted. Judicial oversight and the way forward. Supreme Court has intervened by examining section 152's constitutionality and shielding journalists. However, defiance by police authorities shows that judicial orders alone may not prevent the misuse. Even after even after saying that coercive action should not take place, summons have been issued. So this is a complete defiance of the order of the Supreme Court. Stronger oversight and recognition of sedition's incompatibility with democracy are essential. In a democracy, there has to be dissent. If dissent is not there, it is not a democracy. So you cannot just categorize every speech or action as something which is endangering the unity and sovereignty and integrity of the country. So that is what you have to keep in mind. Do remember what is 152 of Section 152 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita and the earlier Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to a very important concern in the overall health aspect of the population, and that is stunting with respect to the children. Now, what the author says is that in the year 2016, we had 38% of the children under the age of 5 years of age who were stunted. So the government came up with a program, different program, for example, the Poshan program, in order to reduce this particular aspect of stunting. And the aim was to reduce this particular stunting to 25% by the year 2022. But what she says is, as of now, the stunting remains at 37%. So from the year 2016 till the year 2025, there has been a reduction of only 1%. And there are multiple reasons for that, why we have not been able to make progress on this aspect. First is, for example, the teen pregnancies. Women are getting married at an earlier age, they conceive, they get pregnant, and ultimately even their body is not having the adequate nutrients. So how much nutrients would flow into the babies, right? So that is one of the important concerns. Then we also have the issue of education of mothers. Mothers are not educated, so they do not know about the importance of what a healthy diet is all about. Then there are issues with respect to the breastfeeding practices. Then there are increasing cases of C-sections, right, which has led to the reduction of the breastfeeding, right? Then what the author says is that there have been issues with respect to the sanitation that saps. If you have a particular disease which is caused because of the water, sanitation and hygiene, right? So it saps the nutrition from the children, and therefore the children might be stunted. So there are different arguments which the author is saying, very, very important data. Poshan Abhiyan and targets launched in 2018 with the aim to reduce the child stunting by 2 percentage points annually. Baseline was 2016 and it was 38.4%. Target was 25% by 2022. Mission 25 by 2022. But the current data as of June 2025 says that we have 37% of the population as stunted. Only there has been 1% reduction. Just 1% improvement since 2016. Look at this. The share of children aged below 5 years of age who were stunted in India. NFHS 4 data, 38.4%. NFHS 5, 35.5. Right now we have 37. Just 1% reduction in so many years. State-wise share of the children aged below 5 years of age who were stunted as of June 2025. In states like UP, we have almost 48.5% of the children under the age of 5. Can you imagine? Almost 50% are stunted. Then 43% in Jharkhand, Assam, 42%. So again, there is a great burden of disease. Why stunting persists? Maternal health and teen pregnancies. Nearly half of stunted children are born small. Early pregnancies weaken the maternal and child health. Mothers are themselves do not have the adequate nutritional content in their body. How would the nutrition flow to the baby? That's a but obvious question. 7% of the women 15 to 19 years of age had begun childbearing. Can you imagine? We have child marriages even taking place right now. We feel that they don't take place, but they're taking place, and ultimately that compromises the health of the mother as well as the child. Data is from the National Family Health Survey. You can just have a look. Education of mothers. There's a strong correlation with respect to the education of mothers and the kind of nutrition intake which the children have. 46% stunted, no schooling, versus 26% of stunted, 12 plus years of schooling. So if the mother is educated, definitely the chances of stunting of the child are less. That is what the impact of education is all about. Education gives better nutrition, antenatal care, delayed pregnancies. Then you have delivery practices. There have been increasing cases of C-sections, right? Rise from 9% in 2005. Right now we have almost 22% taking with respect to the C-section. There has been tremendous increase with respect to C-section. What happens is this can delay the breastfeeding initiation, depriving the infants of colostrum. Now this is very important once we talk about the initial nutrient requirement of the baby, right? But because of the increasing C-sections, this intake has not been possible with respect to the children. Breastfeeding practices, only 64% of the infants less than 6 months exclusively breastfed. Then we have economic class divide affects the ability to breastfeed. What it is trying to say is that we have the maternity benefit of almost 6 months for the ladies working in the formal sector. So they can give time and resources to the child. But what about, let's say, the domestic workers? They do not have the time. And how would she basically cater to the needs of the children? That is a question which the author is asking. Poor diet diversity. Diets right now, what we are having. See, initially we discussed that previously we had a millets dominated diet, a diversified basket. But right now we are dependent upon more on the carbohydrates, heavy diets which are dominated by the carbohydrates, lacking the proteins and micronutrients. Only 11% of the children receive a minimum acceptable diet. See, these data points are really very important. You can use in any of the questions with respect to these particular areas, right? Anemia, 57% of the women, almost 60% are anemic. 67% of the children under 5 are anemic. Almost 70%. Sanitation and infections. 19% households practice open defecation, one of the biggest sources of disease. So we still have 19%, and we have so many data, giving that Swachh Bharat Abhiyan did this, but the reality is very different. Unsafe water and poor sanitation weaken the gut health, malnutrition, infection cycle. There's a vicious cycle, because once you have a particular children suffering from a disease, it would sap the nutrients, and once the child is sick, he will not eat, and then that would also weaken the body, and there would be a vicious cycle, right? Consequences of stunting, not just short height, poor cognitive development. We just think stunted children have short height. No, it also affects their cognitive abilities, right? Reduced employability, intergenerational poverty cycle. It continues from one generation to the other. Stunting is the tip of the iceberg of the deprivation, according to the author. So there have to be adequate focus upon this aspect, not just through schemes, by saying that we have this scheme and that scheme. There has to be adequate effort at the ground level, primarily through the Anganwadi centers or through the Asha workers. That is really very important. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to a very important species, which is the saltwater crocodile. Its population has increased in the Sundarban Biosphere Reserve, right? So the estimated population of the saltwater crocodiles, one of the largest reptiles in the world, has increased in the Sundarban Biosphere Reserve, becomes important for the exam. Population assessment and habitat ecology study of the saltwater crocodiles in Sundarbans for the year 2025. The saltwater crocodile is the largest in the crocodilian order. The report describes them as hyper-carnivorous apex predators. They are the apex predators, hyper-carnivorous, that keep the flowing water ecosystems clean. Why? Because you have the dead bodies of the animals, and you have these saltwater crocodiles who feed upon them, and therefore make the whole water clean, right? Filtering mechanism by feeding upon the carcasses. In India, the saltwater crocodile are distributed across the swamplands, rivers, mangroves of Odisha, West Bengal, coastal areas around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That is how you use the information. That is a sentence which would be, copy pasted in the UPSC. So use the information effectively. Let's talk about the saltwater crocodile. It is the largest of the 23 species of the extant or the live crocodilians. This include true crocodiles, alligators, and caimans. The salty is also called as the estuarine crocodile because it lives in the brackish water systems, right? And as the name suggests, it is typically found in the brackish water of estuaries. It can also tolerate salt water in the oceans and can travel long distances over the open oceans, making the use of tidal currents, right? So as you have the tides, the level of the water increases, they enter the oceans and then come back again. This particular species is found in 3 locations: the Sundarbans, Bhitarkanika National Park, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Important, do remember this. It is one of the 3 crocodiles native to the Indian subcontinent, with the other as the Magar crocodile and the Ghadials. It is also found in Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Australia. Threats, we have the habitat destruction, fragmentation, we have the construction of dams, right, which is basically stopping the flow or from one place to the other of these crocodiles. So that is obviously fragmenting the habitat. Transformation, fishing activities, and the use of crocodile parts for medicinal purposes. What is the protection status of the saltwater crocodile? We have the IUCN list of threatened species, where it lists this particular species as least concern. Sites, we have the Appendix 1, except for the populations of Australia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, which are included in Appendix 2. Wildlife Protection Act list in the Schedule 1. That is what you have to understand, and it might be important for the examination. Let's go to the next article. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to the multi-state cooperative societies. So in an answer in the Lok Sabha, Amit Shah, the Minister for the Cooperation, has said that 2 seats have been reserved for the women and 1 seat for the scheduled castes or scheduled tribes on the boards of multi-state cooperative societies. So this becomes important. So we have the cooperative societies as a part 9b. The Part 9b of the Constitution grants constitutional status to the cooperative societies and contains provisions for their democratic functioning. It was inserted by the 97th Constitutional Amendment Act of 2011. Cooperative societies, now this is important, probably a question can come, fall under the entry 32 of the state list. They are in the state list, entry 32. In the 7th schedule of the Constitution, hence, regulation and governance of the cooperative societies fall primarily under the jurisdiction of the state legislatures. The 97th Amendment added Article 19, Subclause 1, Subclause C to the Part 3rd, Fundamental Rights of the Constitution, which made forming cooperative societies as a part of the fundamental right to form associations or unions or cooperative societies. The Amendment Act also amended Part 4, Directive Principles of State Policy, and added an article, Article 43B. This new article directs the state to promote voluntary formation, autonomous functioning and democratic control and professional management of these cooperative societies. By placing in the DPSP, the Constitution gave policy direction to the state for the development of cooperative societies. See, again, these cooperative societies work on a no-profit basis, right? An equal participation of all. So therefore, their existence is very important for equitable development. That's the reason we have constitutionalized this particular structure. Initially, 97 Amendment inserted Part 9B, Articles ZS to ZT, making certain provisions mandatory for all the states. But it was a very important verdict of 2021. Rajendra N. Shah versus Union of India. The Supreme Court held that since cooperative societies are a part of the state list, entry 32, the amendment should have been ratified by at least half of the states, but this was not done so. So what the Supreme Court said, that those provisions which are related to the cooperatives with respect to the states, they are now nullified. Whereas those provisions which are with respect to the multi-state cooperative societies, they exist. That is what you have to understand. Since such ratification was not done, Part 9B is not binding on the state for matters falling under their exclusive jurisdiction. It should be noted here that forming a cooperative societies is a constitutional right. Forming is a constitutional right, but being a member of the same is not a right as guaranteed by the Constitution. The same is governed by the respective laws of the state related to that particular cooperative. The multi-state cooperatives fall within the jurisdiction of the union government. There can be a possible question in the prelims that cooperatives fall under entry 32 of the state list, but multi-state cooperatives fall under the union list as entry 44. Corporations, whether trading or not, with objects not confined to one state of the union list, list 1. Hence, central government can make laws regarding the same. And that's the reason you have the Union Minister for Corporation saying this particular answer, giving this particular answer with respect to the reservation of seats for the SCs or the STs. Let's go to the last topic. Coming to the last topic of today's discussion, this is with respect to the phenomena of cloudburst. Now, we have had a lot of discussions earlier with respect to different phenomena. For example, the glacial lake outburst flood or the cloudburst. Now, these are very important areas. Probably a question can come in the prelims or the mains. Now, we have this particular news from the Union Territory of Jammu Kashmir, which says that many people have lost their lives because of the incident or the phenomena of the cloudburst in a particular area. The death toll in the cloudburst hit village of Sisoti in Jammu Kashmir's Kishtwar district rose to 64 on Tuesday. Rescue teams are working in multiple locations, especially at a spot near the community kitchen, frequently by Machail Mata pilgrims, which is believed to have suffered significant damage in the flash floods triggered by the cloudburst on August 14. Now, this is very important. Flash flood, what does it mean? Sudden outburst of water, which is beyond the carrying capacity of that particular passage. And what ultimately happens is that it brings along with it a lot of debris, unconsolidated material, and because of that you have a lot of these houses and infrastructure, it is submerged, and therefore we have a lot of casualty which takes place. Now, flash floods can take place because of the GLOF events, where you have the glacial lake outburst flood, or because of a cloudburst. What happens in a cloudburst is that you have the moisture which is basically encountering a particular mountain or a barrier, and the rising air cools and it condenses. Clouds are then formed. Now, at the top level, what you see is that there is lack of upward air, and then because of it, there is a kind of an obstruction which is there, and it prevents the dissipation of the moisture. Slowly the moisture increases, and at a point of time, the holding capacity of the cloud, it's reduced, and all of a sudden there's a sudden outpour of the rain. And what happens is that once you have sudden outpour, once you have sudden bursting of the water, it is again it crosses the carrying capacity of the passages, and therefore you have these flash floods, and therefore we have these incidents where a lot of people die because of these flash floods, which are induced by the cloudburst, or it can also be induced by the GLOF events. So that is what you have to understand. Possibly in the mains there can be a question of explain the event of cloudburst. You can just have a look at this particular infographic. Stored water falls at one time, steep slope causes the flash floods. So you have the reason is flash floods, but the inducing factor is cloudburst. That's it for today's discussion. I hope this discussion was really helpful for you. All the very best. Thank you so much.